And welcome to the law enforcement breakout session. I'm the moderator today. I'm Dr. Mei Jiang from the Department of Educational Leadership at Texas A&M Commerce. And with me, I'm grateful that Dr. Julia Bollinger will be our co-moderator today to help me with the whole session. And we're honored to have 4 panelists today. We have Judge Steve Teske. We have our former commissioner of Texas Educational Agency, AJ Crabio. And we have the CEO of Houston Revision, Mr. Charles Rotromo. And we have the fraud investigator from Durham Police Department, Mr. Joe Turner. And right now I want to briefly introduce each one of them. And after that, they're going to give us a short presentation of their, on the topic of law enforcement and systemic racism and share their insights. Judge Stephen Teske is the chief presiding judge of the Juvenile Court of Clayton County, Georgia. He was appointed juvenile court judge in 1999 and also served as a superior court judge by designation, presiding over civil and criminal matters. Judge Teske has testified before Congress on 4 occasions and several state legislatures on detention reform, zero tolerance policies in schools, juvenile justice reform, juvenile justice grant accountability, and the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act reauthorization. Judge Teske served as a legislative expert for the U.S. Department of Justice in the school-to-prison pipeline case, United States of America versus Meridia et al., resulting in a landmark consent decree demanding sweeping reforms of school disciplinary practices that were harmful to kids of color. He received numerous awards and recognitions. He is the 2018 recipient of the Juvenile Law Center Leadership Prize Award. Next, we have Mr. AJ Crabio, and he's the former deputy commissioner of TEA, and raised in and out of foster care from birth until high school. Mr. Crabio bounced around enough to have attended 11 schools prior to graduation. He attended urban, suburban, and rural schools, private, public, and parochial schools, lived with white families and families of color in racist and inclusive communities.
Dr. John, your presentation is not staying with each person. Is that okay? It's moving.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Because I think that's a setting of the PowerPoint. It's
okay.
Rotating anyway.
Yes, no problem.
I'm sorry if that's the problem.
Not a problem.
Mm-hmm. And guided by the idea that the student outcome don't change until adult behaviors change, Mr. Crabio has devoted much of his adult life to advocate for the well-being of our nation's most vulnerable youth. Mr. Crabio has served as the board chair for Kansas City Public School, governance advisor for the Council of the Great City Schools, and deputy commissioner for the Texas Education Agency. And next, we have Mr. Charles Rotromo. Mr. Rotromo has worked with disconnected and juvenile justice involved youth in Houston for over 30 years. He is the chief executive officer of Houston Revision, a nonprofit organization that builds positive peer pressure culture for kids on the edge throughout the greater Houston area. Mr. Rotromo is a native Houstonian and a cum laude graduate of Rice University, where he was awarded the Weber Durkheim Award for Excellency in Sociology for his own senior honor thesis on juvenile corrections. Charles is the current president of the Homeless Youth Network for Houston, Harris County. In his free time, he has also been active in the Houston soccer communities since 2006. As a coach, he has won 4 Texas State soccer championships. And last but not least, we have Mr. Joe Turner. Mr. Joe Turner is a fraud investigator in the Financial Crime Unit at Durham Police Department in North Carolina. Born in Franklin, Virginia, Mr. Turner grew up moving around throughout the country due to his father's job, ending up in Jacksonville, Florida. He graduated from Elon University in 2000 with a bachelor's degree in history. Mr. Turner enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in October 2004. In January 2006, Mr. Turner was deployed to Marine Corps Air Station Al-Assad in Iraq. In August 2009, Mr. Turner began his basic law enforcement training with the Durham Police Department and was made class leader of Academy 31. Upon successful completion of field training, he was assigned to District 2 C Squad. After spending 9 years on 2C, Mr. Turner was made a patrol training officer instructing new officers during their field training. In February 2019, Mr. Turner was promoted to the rank of investigator and assigned to Crime Investigations Division Financial Crime Unit, or they call themselves Fraud Squad. He has received numerous commendations, including Officer of the Month in January 2014, and was awarded the Medal of Valor in 2017. He's also a member of International Association of Financial Crimes and Investigations. So now before we start, we invite all the panelists to share their insights on this topic. We're going to make it clear that each panelist has 15 minutes for their presentation. And at the end, we're going to have about 20 minutes Q&A. So all the audience, if you have any questions, please put it into the chat box. And I will be using the cue cards to remind our panelists to keep track of the time. Now, let's welcome Judge Steve Teske and to hear about his perspectives on the topic of law enforcement and what they do to handle to face the reality under the time of pandemic and systemic racism.
Hi. Thank you, Professor. As she is putting my PowerPoint up on the screen, let me just share this, that, you know, as she said in introducing me, that I took the bench in 1999, and I inherited a system that was, quite frankly, systemically, racially biased. My county, Clayton County, if you fly into the world's busiest airport in Atlanta, GA, you're flying into my county, okay? So that gives you a geographical fix of where I work. And you know, the Olympics in 1996 transformed the metro Atlanta area, and to clean up the the face, so to speak, of ATL, you know, they started moving people around. You know, so a lot of those folks were inner city folks, and a lot of those inner city folks were people of color. And let's just accept the fact, and I'll state it plainly to you, that in my experience as a white person, that, you know, that Black folks, African Americans, still suffer much from poverty as a result of the 300 plus years of slavery and segregation, for which people of my complexion still have the difficulty accepting. Just because the Brown versus Board of Education, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, somehow people, still too many people of my complexion think that because of those civil liberties that all of a sudden people of color were able to get economic mobility overnight. Well, that's ridiculous. That's stupidity, okay? And I'll just be frank about that. But why it's important to me is because many of those inner city folks were people of color, that many of them ended up in my county, and that transformed our county greatly, where when I took the bench, we were starting to move from a majority white county to a majority African-American county, all right? And with that, you know, and let me just say this, you may be able to get move the child out of the house, but you can't move the house out of the child so easily. And what I mean by that is that you had all these kids that were living in projects, and that culture of living in projects were now moved out of those projects into single family dwellings at a low cost with vouchers, but they still behaved in projects. And I experienced a number of arrests of kids of color for criminal trespassing when in fact there was no criminal intent whatsoever. These were kids who, when they got off the bus, they would all go next to building A, let's say. That's what they were used to. And they were just hanging out, no criminal intent. And they were doing the same thing. They would find a cut through by a house from one neighborhood to another. They'd hang out there. Next thing you know, some homeowner was calling the police and these kids were being arrested, and I was seeing them in court. And, as a result of that, and one other thing, I noticed that there were too many kids that were being arrested on campus for minor offenses, for disorderly conduct. And most of them were kids of color, okay? And, as I broke down the data, and I'll show it to you here, I realized that something had to be done, okay? So with that said, let's see here. I'm trying to go back. Professor, I'm having a little trouble here going back here.
Okay, are you sharing or
Yeah, can you go back because it's not working for me.
Okay. So please let me know which page you want to stay
Go
on.
to the first one, the first, yeah.
This is the first one, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So I developed, if you Google my name, Judge Teskey, you'll see all this stuff, okay? But in 2003, I gathered all my stakeholders, the chiefs of police, the school superintendent, social services, mental health, and what I did is I showed them all the data, regarding how that since we put school resource officers in place, okay, that there was about a 1,200% increase in arrests, of which 92% of those offenses were minor misdemeanor offenses, things that I did as a kid. Let me just put it plainly to you, okay? So this ended up being called the School Justice Partnership Model, okay? And it has been studied, it has been researched. In fact, hold on a second, I just happen to have it right here. You can get the book. I don't know if you can see it here, okay? But it's a handbook for evidence-based juvenile justice systems, researched by James C. Howe, Mark Lipsey, and John J. Wilson. Those are researchers. And in this book, describes the School Justice Partnership Model as an evidence-based juvenile justice program or system, okay? And so you see the definition of the School Justice Partnership Model there. Basically it is a group of stakeholders, okay? Who in some way are involved in the juvenile justice system, whether they know it or not, okay? If they're dealing with kids, they're potentially intersecting with the juvenile justice system. And so what we do is we meet periodically to manage and sustain a process, okay, guided by an interbranch agreement, a written agreement, designed to promote school climate as well as school and public safety using restorative and educational practices and clinical responses if necessary. Professor, if we go to the next slide there.
Sorry, I'm learning how to do that, right? Okay.
Okay. It is guided by the epidemiology model, so public health model, okay? And in the epidemiology model, basically, you know, in terms of studying diseases and trying to eradicate diseases, which like we're trying to do right now with the pandemic, this is what they do, is that it's developing surveillance measures and prevention procedures for groups that are targeted by whatever disease it may be that's at risk, to identify the causation and then develop the strategies that impact both groups and populations. All right. I mean, this, what it does, it shifts from a targeted reaction to a population-based prevention. And so that's what I learned to apply in terms of, you know, juvenile crime. Professor, next one. So, and I learned this from my father because that's what he did. He retired from CDC, okay? He did infectious diseases. And he taught me that, you know, diseases do not occur by chance. Diseases are not distributed at random. So he said, you know, son, I'm not saying that delinquent behaviors or disruptive behaviors are diseases, but they do behave like diseases. So you take the word diseases and replace it with the word disruptive behaviors or delinquent behaviors. You see, delinquent behaviors do not occur by chance. They're not distributed at random, okay? Which means they can be studied to determine the underlying causes. He told me way back in 2002 and 2003, he said, son, the problem with you folks in criminal justice is that you punish the symptom instead of finding the underlying cause. That's your problem. All right. So with that said, Professor, next one. So you could see here what I said earlier. Notice that increase. Once we put school resource officers in place, okay, we had this dramatic increase in kids arrested on campus, in which 92% were misdemeanor offenses. In other words, the felonies never really changed. But what we ended up doing, okay, is arresting all these kids for typical adolescent behavior, of which most of them were African American. I'll show you that graph in a moment. But let me say this. I'm not here to blast school resource officers, by the way, okay? All right, we still have school resource officers. You see the dramatic decrease, okay? We're looking at about a 95% decrease in school arrests, and it wouldn't have been possible without the help of the school resource officers. What we had to do was retrain, retool our school resource officers. And I will tell you right now, okay, that the way that our SROs operate, okay, they have become a benefit in increasing graduation rates in our school system, okay? So you gotta be careful. Some people have argued that the answer to this zero tolerance problem is to get rid of SROs. Well, maybe so, if you have an SRO program that's just ridiculously operating. But in my county, they're actually helping to promote graduation rates. So be careful about that. Next one. We need to understand that why we have this problem is that we need to focus on the kids that scare us, not the kids who make us mad. This is a 3-year recidivist study of kids that were diverted from my court, of which about 70% of them we never saw again, okay? All right, next slide. So what we did is we replaced arrest with restorative practices, like you see here, in educational programs. I don't have time to go in all of those, and you'll have access to this PowerPoint slide, okay? They'll make sure if you want it, you can get it. The program referral outcomes. Now, those kids that were referred to restorative practices, let's take a look at 2011 and 2012. There are 420 kids referred. Only 55 repeated. But yet before this, we instituted the School Justice Partnership, all 420 kids were handcuffed and brought to juvenile court. You hear what I'm saying? All were handcuffed, but only 55 in the new program recidivated. It begs the question, why were we handcuffing 420 kids? We were making them worse. We were harming and traumatizing them. Next one. Now, Our graduation rates have increased. Now, you folks in education know what happened in 2011. The feds had changed how the graduation formula. But the red line shows that regardless of that, going from, um, you know, um, you know, overall graduation rates to on-time graduation rates, our graduation rates have increased every single year since we instituted the School Justice Partnership. How go, how go kids, so go graduation rates, okay? All right, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would improve graduation rates? As a result of this, how go graduation rates, so go juvenile crime rates. Our delinquent arrests are down 82%. You hear what I'm saying? Next slide. Our felonies, that's the most important one. Oh, kids commit misdemeanors. I committed many misdemeanors when I was a kid, but it's the felonies you want to be concerned about. There's been a decline 64%, okay, in felonies. That's 64% fewer victims in our county. Next slide. Oh, that's it. And I think that I did it. I have 2 minutes left. I just want to cap by saying this, ladies and gentlemen. There's so much about why this works, but the key to reducing juvenile crime is mostly about education and trauma. But I want to say this, and this is the most important part in terms of racial disparities. I don't know why I did not have the graph on there, but the graph that I have shows that as a result of these school arrests, that a child of color was 12 times more likely to be arrested than a child of my complexion. I want you to know, with the 95% decrease, that a child of color is just as likely to be arrested as a child of my complexion. Okay? So that's what is important. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I don't care where your heart is, I don't care where your head is. I don't care how much you may think that you're colorblind or what, we all have implicit bias. Most important of all, if you're in a broken system, regardless of how good your head and heart is, you're still going to make broken decisions, whether you like it or not. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, Judge Steve Teske, for sharing your insights. And next we have Mr. AJ Crabio. Let's hear from him about his story and his insights.
Thank you, and appreciations, Judge. Greatly enjoyed the slides and the information you shared. A lot of what I had intended to share is largely an echo of the slides that you've already put on the screen. And so this will be fairly short and we can save more time for Q&A. I wanted to offer just 4 vignettes from my own experience. From the time I was 17 to 27, I had fairly regular interactions with law enforcement, at least once, twice, 3 times per year. And every time I would have interactions with law enforcement, it would involve me being handcuffed, being questioned, and almost every single time ultimately being let go, normally associated with either traffic, though one time I was simply walking. And so a memory that stands out, I was 27, I remember the exact intersection I was at. That's how vivid of a memory it was, is that I was driving along, I look in my rear view, I noticed a police officer with his lights on, I pull over. At this point, I know the drill. I know that the car is going to be searched. I know that I'm going to be accused of things. I know that I'll be handcuffed. And so I just kind of mentally prepare for, what is normal. The officer approaches the driver's side car, asks for license and registration. I show it. He looks at it, hands it back, said, your tail light's out. You might want to take care of that. Have a good day. And then he hops in his car and drives away. And I was stunned, utterly stunned. So stunned, in fact, that I immediately started calling all of my friends. And when I call my Black friends, it's like, hey, y'all not gonna believe what just happened. Y'all got pulled over. and he just let me go. Like, yeah, as usual, I wasn't doing anything wrong, but there were no handcuffs. I didn't get arrested. I didn't get questioned. I didn't get accused of having drugs or stealing a car. Like, y'all won't believe it. And they were like, really, that happened? Man, like, are you just like getting old now? Like, what happened? Like, was there an emergency across town that you had to get to? Like, we just couldn't understand it. Like, we were all just trying to piece together the puzzle of how I just got let go. The circumstance didn't really resonate for me in the permanent way that it's now burned into my mind until I started contacting my white friends and said, hey man, y'all won't believe it. Cop pulled me over, he just let me go. And all of them were like, okay, so then what? Like, is there, what's the other part of the story? It's like, no, I didn't get handcuffed. It's like, okay, is that special? And it was in that moment that I realized every single one of my African-American friends had very similar experiences to my own. And none, not a single one of my white friends had experiences that mirrored my own, that their interactions with law enforcement occurred just as well in that same decade of their lives. But not a single one of my white friends had ever been handcuffed, not once in life. And so this is a wake-up call. That's one vignette. Juxtaposed to that, I also served for a time as the vice president of my neighborhood association. And our neighborhood was one of the more dangerous communities in the city as it relates to violent crime. And we really wanted to have an impact on this as a neighborhood association. That these are not the circumstances we wanted for our children, for our families. And so we got together and started to develop a plan around how to produce safety in the community. And a significant part of that plan was to make a demand of the local police department, the particular branch that served our neighborhood, that they needed to show up at our monthly neighborhood meetings. They needed to give a report, and they needed to take information from us, whatever it is we chose to share. And if we had recommendations for where we wanted a heightened presence in our neighborhood, that we expected them to be responsive to that. And if there are places where we felt like there was too heightened of presence, we expected them to be responsive to that as well. What developed over the next few years was this really respectful relationship that our local police officers had with our neighborhood association, such that it became the norm that we were given the cell phone numbers for all three watches, and were essentially instructed as neighborhood leaders, if you have challenges, don't call 911, because who knows who you'll get. But we know who you all are. We've worked with you. We've collaborated with you. We're comfortable taking direction from you all as neighborhood leaders. So just contact us directly. And I remember an evening where there was a disturbance across the street and a few houses down from me. And it was probably 11 o'clock at night. I go outside and there are police everywhere, and they're grabbing random young black men and putting them in handcuffs to take them away. And I run outside and I immediately see one of the officers from the neighborhood. And he says, "Hey, how you doing? Can you stand back so we can take care of this?" I said, No, let me help you out, officer. That young man, like, these young people, they live here. This is their neighborhood. Now, though I don't know who those guys are. But all of these young men, they live here on this block. They have every right to be here, even if they're being noisy and causing a disturbance. And so the officer immediately, based on that, directed the other officers to let them go and told the young men, hey, head back to your houses while we address these other people who were not from the neighborhood, who were actually causing the challenge on the block. It was in that circumstance that I realized that us as a neighborhood exerting leadership regarding the activities of the police was not only appropriate, but in the context of the relationship that we had built with them was welcome. That's the second vignette. Those are more community-based. For the other two vignettes, I want to move more towards school-based. one of the things that I experience is moving around and bouncing around a lot as a child is that sometimes I went to schools where I looked like everyone else, and there are other schools where I was easy to identify in a crowd. One such year, I was sitting in class and a group of police officers, not school officers, police officers, came into the class, grabbed me, and took me outside in front of the school building and began to pat me down and demand to know where the explosives were. I had no idea what they were talking about, was completely confused, and told them as such, at which point they started systematically removing my clothing there in front of the school building. And I'll never forget the sense of shame and embarrassment I felt looking over and seeing the faces of all these white students pressed up against the windows of all the classrooms, looking outside, watching as this group of police officers surrounding me and essentially strip searching me there in front of the school. It's the third vignette. And then the fourth. A few years ago, I had the privilege of working with some of our city officials on trying to think about how do we create protection for our young people in our classrooms and out in the community. And so we brainstormed, we thought through this. And what we came up with was this idea for a restorative justice project that would be a partnership between the school district and the city. For the city's part, they brought to the table the city prosecutor as well as the city police department. And obviously we brought the school administration as well as our internal resource officers. And what we ultimately built, we refer to as a council of elders. But it was a pretty standard restorative justice initiative where whether the behavior started in the school or started in the neighborhood, when our students were involved and when certain criteria were met, it was predominantly first-time, non-violent offenders, non-drug related, things of that nature, that instead of those children being processed into the system, that they would be referred back to us and the restorative justice initiative with the express intention of ensuring that they were never given a number in the criminal justice system. What we found is as soon as our young people, were numbered, as soon as they had this record, that there seemed to be a radically different reception that they received at the hands of law enforcement than if they didn't have a number in the system. And so our intention with our restorative justice initiative was to prevent them from ever being numbered at all. And so we initiated this in partnership with the police department, in partnership with the city, the prosecutor's office. And in the first 2 years of the program, with all the young people that we served, only one of them had a arrest, or our recidivism rate essentially dropped to 1 of all the young people that we worked with and served. That simply creating a restorative justice approach to it by having accountability for what harm was created, having the people who were harmed in the circle with us, having fellow young people and students as part of the conversation, and creating accountability for what will I do to repair the harm, and then creating a plan for that. And then as long as that plan was implemented on the timeline that we created, that no additional paper trail would be generated and that it would never go beyond that. What we found is that over time, that was a meaningful partnership that really made a difference regarding the likelihood of our students to have negative interactions with law enforcement going forward. That's the fourth vignette. As I piece these 4 things together, kind of 3 significant lessons leap forward. The first is that this is messy. That not every interaction I had with police officers was a negative one, but a lot of them were. Nevertheless, in order to be successful in advocating for students, I've had to embrace unlikely partners and the messiness that comes from that. I'm inspired recently by the words of our recently deceased Supreme Court Justice. Fight for the things you believe in, but do it in a way that inspires people to join you. And so the first lesson I draw from these 4 vignettes is that there is messiness out there. There is racism. It is real. It is not contrived. It is not something we've just made up. But inside of those same systems, there are people who are willing to be part of the problem, and we have to find ways to make that happen. The second lesson that emerges for me is that our metrics and how we got to meaningful partnerships involved holding law enforcement officers, both in the community and in schools, responsible for impact and not intent. Everybody wants credit for what they intended and what they were meaning to do or what they meant to accomplish. That is not acceptable. When the well-being of children is on the line, we have to build metrics to evaluate the efficacy of policing work based on the impact it has on our children, not the intentions of our officers. And then the third, what I hope rings very clear in the vignettes I gave, was the difference between when those who are policed are leading the police rather than they are simply victimized by them. And in the vignettes that I shared where we saw real success in partnership with law enforcement, it's because those who were being policed, both as the neighborhood association and as school officials, when we stepped into the driver's seat and said, this is what we need this support from law enforcement to look like, that made a difference for us. That simply being led around or pushed around that's not a sustainable or effective model for policing. There has to be a partnership, and that law enforcement has to be willing to accept the leadership of those whom they're policing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. A.J. Crabio. Thanks for voicing out for the kids who are on the edge, at risk, and who really need help, who have faced so much challenges, in their lives, who hasn't been treated well. And next we have Mr. Charles Rotramo. I'm going to play the PowerPoint for you.
Great. So my name is Charles Rotramo. I am the CEO of a nonprofit in Houston called Houston Revision. And our work is primarily with young people in the juvenile justice system. We've been around for 10 years, although I've been doing work with juvenile justice youth for a lot longer than that. Typically, we work with a lot of young people that are in juvenile facilities. We work with young people who are on probation, and we have about 450 volunteers that we recruit from faith communities and connect them as mentors to young people. So what I want to focus on is our COVID response, because I think there's a real sense of hope with what is possible in our pivot during COVID, because we are in the process of affecting a sea change in the justice system in Harris County, Texas. And so I want to go through that with you, because I think while Harris County is large, it's larger than 6 states, and has a very diverse population. There are lessons that can be learned for any jurisdiction here. We know that the vast majority of young people in the juvenile justice system are Black and Latinx. That is a fact. In Harris County, it's almost exclusively Black and Latinx youth, in that order. And so we began in March an effort to stay connected to our young people. If you can go back to the first slide, please. No, the next one. That one, yes, thank you. So here's what we did. We decided that we needed to see our young people every day. And so we organized a group of our staff and our volunteers, and we visited our young people every single day. We employed a strict safety protocol to ensure that COVID was not, spreading. And we consulted with the Texas Policy Lab at Rice University to develop those safety protocols. We hired a chef to cook hot meals for our young people and for their families. And so we delivered a hot meal, supplemental food, hygiene supplies, household goods, and accurate information about the virus, which is at a premium, as you know, at this time, especially among our community. And we did that every day. We also gave them information about how and where to get COVID-19 testing. We partnered with the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department. The executive director of Harris County Juvenile Probation, I just need to give him a shout out, which is my friend Henry Gonzalez. Henry is a leader, a national leader in juvenile justice reform. And Henry has a vision to dramatically shrink the juvenile justice system in Harris County. So when revision began in 2010, I would always make presentations and say, today in Harris County, Texas, there are 750 young people who are incarcerated in juvenile facilities, and almost every single one of them is Black and Latinx. Well, when Henry took office in September of 2018, his vision began to be implemented. And during COVID, we were able to get a number of other young people released. And so now, today, I'm proud to announce that there are fewer than 100 young people in Harris County that are incarcerated in juvenile facilities. The vast majority are still Black and Latinx youth, but at least we're reducing the numbers. So we partnered with the Juvenile Probation Department. Their staff volunteered as revision volunteers to accompany our drivers to conduct check-in visits with youth who were furloughed from juvenile detention. And I want to call out that term. There was no such thing as a furlough program from juvenile detention prior to March of 2020. In COVID, Henry created this furlough program and furloughed the vast majority of young people from juvenile facilities in Harris County. And so these probation staff who were going out with our drivers were not serving as probation officers. They were not supervising or working on compliance. They were simply serving as revision volunteers. They were seeing the world from our perspective. How are the kids doing? How are their families doing? What needs do they have? And I think that represents a real shift in the perspective for a lot of these officers. And we had dozens and dozens of these juvenile probation staff that volunteered over the last 6 months and are still volunteering. So then our staff stayed in touch with the families and the youth by phone every day. We were able to connect them to licensed clinical social workers when mental health needs presented themselves. We reached out to our partner nonprofits to support their youth as well. There are a couple of nonprofits in our community that work with similar populations of young people, and we said, we'll work with any of your young people as well. We'll visit them every day. We'll deliver food to them and whatever needs they have. And so we were able to dramatically expand our population. And then more recently, we've helped all of the youth enroll and engage in school, which is all online in Houston, at least in Houston ISD right now. And I know a lot of you are experiencing how difficult that is, but we've been able to get every single one of our youth enrolled and engaged in school. May, if you could change the slide now. So here's an image. This is where we deploy every day from St. Luke's United Methodist Church. This is a group of our volunteers, our staff, and juvenile probation staff. So we go out every single day and visit our kids. As you see, we maintain appropriate safety protocols. But that contact, that daily contact with young people in person has proven to be invaluable. And I think it's really created a different way of seeing what the juvenile justice system can become. May, if you could change the slide now. So here is a capsule of what our young people request. So this is for one particular month in May. So as you see, we have a lot of young people that request hygiene supplies. A lot of them request help with education, connected devices, all those kinds of things. General information about COVID. Our young people are particularly susceptible to misinformation or disinformation about COVID. And so we've been able to provide accurate information. Social engagement has been a big component that we've been able to provide. We have group Zoom calls with our young people every day. We have done restorative justice circles. AJ mentioned restorative justice. We've done a lot of work with restorative justice during COVID. We've provided some employment assistance, helping kids get employed at Amazon or at Walmart, at HEB. We've provided, as I mentioned, mental health services. And of course, some of our young people have ended up homeless during this time. And so we've been able to provide some housing support as well. But this just gives you a sense of the kinds of needs that our young people are expressing. May, if you could change the slide now. So who are our young people? We have served 179 unduplicated individuals in the summer months. It's more since March, but capturing a point in time. These are young people between the ages of 11 and 17. We have served 23 zip codes designated by the city of Houston as disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Our young people are typically disconnected from school, from their family, and from community. Our young people are overwhelmingly male persons of color, primarily Black persons of color, but also we have a lot of Latinx. We have many immigrants and refugees, many from Central America and African countries. We work with a lot of dual status youth who are co-involved between the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. Our young people, as you can imagine, have experienced trauma, poverty, food insecurity, and housing instability, all of which has been exacerbated during COVID. And the majority of our youth, the vast majority, have had some contact with the justice system. So that's a time capsule of who our population is. That's both before COVID and during COVID. But I think what's really exciting is to think about what is possible here. May, if you could change the slide. So we were able to see 80 youth furloughed, released, and diverted from the Harris County Juvenile Justice System starting on March 27th, 2020, when Henry created that system. During that time, since March, only 6 of those young people have been rearrested. Only 6. And only 3 of those young people have actually been detained. In other words, reincarcerated. So those numbers are staggering, right? We have effectively changed the way the juvenile justice system in Harris County functions. Suddenly, we've reduced, by 5/6 the number of kids in the juvenile justice system, and they're not getting back in trouble. So why is that? Well, I would argue that it's because of that daily contact, because we're seeing them every day, and we're not conducting compliance visits with them. But instead, the posture we're taking is saying, what do you need? How are you doing? How is your family doing? What needs do you have? We'll meet those needs. Whether they're physical needs or emotional needs, we'll meet those needs. But we really care about you and your family and your well-being. I think that posture, and the posture that the probation department has pivoted into during COVID, has completely changed the trajectory of the criminal justice system. And I think that provides some lessons that we can learn moving forward. If you could change the slide now, May. So we've reached about 125 young people a day. We've developed a big partnership. As I mentioned, St. Luke's United Methodist Church is a partner, the probation department, Houston Independent School District is a major partner of ours. The Houston Food Bank has helped us to provide the food along with Christian Community Service Center. We've partnered with the YMCA. St. Stephen's United Methodist Church has a food program also that provides some of our food 2 days a week. We are engaged in 3 separate studies with Baylor College of Medicine and with the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistics at the University of Houston. These research projects, we hope, will provide the basis for other jurisdictions really shifting into this type of approach post-COVID or even during COVID. And we've partnered with 2 of our community-based organizations, My Brother's Keeper, which is an initiative of the City of Houston, and the Center for Urban Transformation, as I mentioned before. May, one more slide. So what's next? What is possible here? I think, we are pivoting now further as school has resumed virtually, and we've developed a virtual mentoring program. So we have our volunteers mentoring kids virtually. We've provided connected devices for many of our young people, and we're doing virtual mentoring visits every day now. We were increasing our mental health services, partnering with our county mental health department, which is called the Harris Center. And really, we're seeing a lot of mental health needs emerge, as you know, and so increasing those services. We've also developed a daily homework help program. So we have volunteers and staff getting on Zoom and Google Meets after school every day, and helping with whatever homework our young people need, which is quite a bit. We've expanded our COVID-19 education. There's so much disinformation out there that we've really needed to increase that. And we see a need to continue to increase that because our young people, unfortunately, still believe, they can't get it, they don't spread it, their families don't get it. And we've had a lot of people get sick in our neighborhoods and among our kids. And so spreading that information and that education is really important. And then our next step, of course, is vaccine preparedness. We're working with the University of Houston and Baylor College of Medicine to prepare our young people and their families to receive a vaccine, which they're resistant to somewhat naturally. And so that's our big push going into the fall and the spring. But I think, I think what we see is possible here is a dramatically reduced juvenile justice system. Why do we need to lock these kids up? AJ talked about the impact that the criminal justice system has, even police contact, any involvement with the criminal justice system has on Black and particularly on Black young people. And I think what we're seeing during this COVID response is there's no need for that for a lot of young people. As Judge Teskey mentioned, felonies are a concern, but the vast majority of young people are not arrested for felonies. They don't come into contact with the criminal justice system for felonies. And so with those kids, this sort of approach, a softer touch, if you will, is proving to be incredibly effective. The lesson learned here is why go back to a broken system? Why repeat mistakes that we've made in the past? Let's learn from the lessons that we're experiencing during this COVID response and shift our juvenile justice system and our criminal justice system away from that punitive response and more to meeting the needs of young people and their families. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rotromo. Thanks for the talk that brings us hope. And next, we want to hear from Mr. Turner to hear about his experience working as the fraud investigator.
Okay. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to, if we can get the I'm going to make a brief statement, and then if we want to roll into my slideshow, that'd be great.
Okay. So are you going to play from your side?
I'm not.
Do you want me to play for you here on this side?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to do it on your side. It's not letting me play.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay.
So, good morning, everyone. Greetings from the Bull City, Durham, North Carolina. As you just heard, I'm Investigator Joel Turner of the Durham Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. And yes, I am Frank and Rosalie Turner's youngest and best-looking son. It's an honor and privilege to speak with y'all today. I'm going to be spending the next 15 or so minutes talking about racial diversity within policing in America, what that looks like, where we are at, and what we can do moving forward. Now, before I go any further on this subject, the views and opinions and conclusions expressed in this study are solely my own. They do not represent the beliefs nor opinions of the Durham Police Department, its command staff, Chief Davis, or the City of Durham. I also want to make it clear that I am not stating that police culture nor conservative white police officers are inherently racist or bigoted. The point I am attempting to make is that there is a dominant mindset that presides over the majority of my profession and makes it difficult for other voices to be heard. Hopefully, by viewing the evidence I've collected, conversations can be had, and from those conversations, actionable change may occur. I came to be involved in this event in a rather roundabout way. Back in the early days of the protests in reaction to the killing of George Floyd, my on-call team was tasked with guarding a mall in southern Durham. I ended up partnering with a friend of mine whom I've known for a while. He's a detective in the Special Victims Unit, and he also happens to be Black. We were discussing Mr. Floyd's death and the protests that followed, and I asked him what it was like being a Black police officer during the time of Black Lives Matter. His response was enlightening, if not a little disturbing. He replied that he wanted to be a police officer because he wanted to have a career that was respected and that was admired by the members of his community. But he said that after he takes off his uniform, he's no longer a cop. He's just a Black man in America, and his job does not protect him from the perils that brings with it. My friend, whom I'll call Jack, then recounted the story in which he was racially profiled in another city. Jack, his wife, and his brother-in-law were traveling back to their house in Durham and had stopped at a gas station. After leaving the gas station, they were pulled over by local police. At first, he was told by the officer that the officer had witnessed a hand-to-hand drug sale. Jack then revealed who he was, or rather what he did for a living. The officer's mood and story changed. The reason for the traffic stop changed to now being about some regulatory violation and had nothing to do with a supposed drug transaction. Jack and his family were let go and went about their way. But as Jack was telling me the story, I could see that it made him quite upset. Even the fact that he was a cop, he could still not escape his skin. This got me thinking, if this sort of thing happened to Jack, then it must have happened to other officers with whom I worked. So I began to ask around, and sure enough, I was right. One fellow detective that I had spoken with told me that he and his family completely avoid going to a certain city because of the experiences he has had with the police of that city. This was something that I just could not fathom. I imagine the ignorance of situations such as these was not limited to just myself, and that other white officers might be just as clueless. So I came up with an idea. I decided that I needed to create an archive of stories and interviews of Black officers. That archive could then be used as a tool for myself and others to learn from. But why should I do this? Simple. Growing up a white middle-class kid in a small town in Mississippi, I had developed my own view of the police based on my own experience. My experience and my culture shaped my opinion of law enforcement, as it does for each individual person in this country. However, in order to grow a more well-rounded and complete view of law enforcement, I needed to listen to the stories of others. That leads me to one of the issues I believe that we are facing today as a profession, our collective culture. From my own experience, I can say that our culture is primarily conservative, white, and male. Repeatedly throughout my career, I have been reminded that my political beliefs and my personal beliefs run counter to the norm of police work. The motivations behind such comments, I am sure, stemmed from a place of jest or just plain curiosity, but what they did was serve to reinforce the idea that I'm an outsider, that I do not belong here. However, what makes me different, what makes me a minority, are choices that I have made and beliefs that I have established. It is not because of the color of my skin, which I cannot change. As the evidence will show, there are some stark contrasts within my profession. Unfortunately, those divisions generally fall along racial lines. My objective today is to examine the racial composition of law enforcement, both nationally and locally, and to look at the differences in opinion that fall along those lines. Finally, I will discuss some solutions that both law enforcement and the general population can follow. So today we are going to examine police culture and see where we can go from here. Next slide, please. All right, when I was a young boy studying history at Elon, one of my philosophical heroes was the great 20th century Jewish existentialist Martin Buber. And he said, the true community does not arise through people's having feelings for one another, but through first, their taking their stand in living mutual relation with a living center, and second, there being a living mutual relation with one another. What that means to me is that the living center he speaks of is our city. For me, that's Durham, but it could be your campus or your county. Whatever it is, we must approach it as if it were a living thing. Secondly, he speaks that we must approach each other as living beings, recognizing the humanity in all of us. Next slide, please. All right, there's going to be 3 bullet points. Here we go. All right, so what we're going to do today, we're going to examine the demographics between the community and the police, examine the relationship between police themselves, and where do we go from here. Next slide. So this graph shows a comparison with the 2010 census with a 2016 study done by the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics, comparing the general population with police. As you can see, generally over the nation, the numbers break down basically along population lines. However, you can see that white people are overrepresented by almost 10%, while blacks and Hispanics only make up 11 and 12% respectively. If you go ahead and click it, there's some bullet points that are going to pop up. And as the overall picture, it does not, you can go back, there you go. This is an overall picture. It does not look at local representation versus local populations. All right, next slide, please. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to compare my city and my department, Durham, to the 3 other largest cities in North Carolina. For starters, we are not Raleigh-Durham. Raleigh-Durham is an airport. Raleigh and Durham are 2 separate cities.
Excuse me, Mr. Turner, please excuse me, but there's some noise, resounding noise, and I just didn't know where it was coming from. Am I the only one that hears it? Can you help us, please?
There's nothing going on. It's probably just my voice.
No, it's not. It's not your voice. Dr. John, do you hear the roaring?
Yes, I heard it. Mr. Turner is the only one with the voice on, so I'm not quite sure where it came from. It's better now.
Yeah.
I think
It
it's
is.
better now. It may be just the techie issue.
Okay. I'm probably
Okay.
overloading the microphone because I'm kind of nervous that I'm talking loud. So,
Echoing of the microphone.
okay, definitely the microphone. All right, we'll proceed. Okay, so as you can see, my city, Durham, has a racial breakdown basically that's even between whites and blacks, with Hispanics being a little less than half of that. There is better representation in the Durham Police Department, obviously, than in Raleigh. As far as minorities go, but blacks are still underrepresented by 10 or 11%. Next slide. Now, Greensboro has also a very similar population distribution as Durham, but far less minority representation within their department than my own. Next slide. And last, we'll look at Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD. Charlotte, like Greensboro, has a similar racial distribution as Durham, but Durham has a better representation with its police department. And the reason why I'm bringing all this up is that it should be noted that the other 3 cities mentioned, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Charlotte, experienced massive civil unrest, looting, and large-scale police actions during the George Floyd protests. Durham did not. It is my belief that one of the reasons for this was due to our increased diversity in our police department. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so why is this important? Even if on a national scale, minority representation in law enforcement is close to the percentage of the population, but when looking at a local level, the gap is much more increased. These differences can affect the manner in which officers relate to themselves, their communities, and fellow officers. And there's one more bullet point that's going to pop up. Increased diversity of a department can have unforeseen benefits for both police departments and communities. All right, next slide. All right, so what are we saying? What are officers saying? All right, next slide. All right, so in 2016, the Pew Research Center did a study in which they surveyed about half of all law enforcement officers working today. One of the questions was asked was, has the United States done enough to ensure equality for blacks, African Americans? 92% of the white officers polled said yes, and that there was no more work to be done. Almost 70% of the black officers that were polled said no, and that we still had more work to do. To me, this points to evidence of a large cultural divide within the ranks of law enforcement. It should also be noted that the 70% of black officers that responded no only comes out of 11% of the total law enforcement population. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we contrast those numbers with the response from the general population. The white response for yes in the general population was 57%, which is 35% lower than the law enforcement response. This is evidence that white police culture is more conservative than mainstream white culture. Next slide, please. So now we move on to officer-involved shootings. In this graph, you can see that white and Hispanic officers basically responded the same. And the question was put forward, are officer-involved shootings isolated incidents, or are they part of a broader problem? And then black officers are more than twice as likely to respond that they are part of a broader problem. Next slide, please. So these are some issues to think about when that mindset is brought up, is how does that change an officer's approach to situations? How does that affect his relationship with other officers? And how does this affect an officer's decision in regards to the use of force continuum? Because, you can go back one. So especially in regards to the use of force, if you believe that officer-involved shootings are just isolated incidents dotted throughout the country, you may be going to force more quickly than if you see them as part of a broader problem. All right, now, next slide, please. So the next one of the other questions was altercations with suspects. And in this slide, you can see that black officers were 13% less likely to have an altercation with a suspect. This could be in relation to the previous slide, as in they believe that officer-involved shootings are part of a broader problem, so they may be less likely to use force on a suspect. But I also want to point out that the majority of officers polled show that they had no altercations with suspects. All right, next slide. And then one of the other questions that was asked was the treatment by police. You know, who is treated better? Are whites treated better? Are minorities treated better? Or are they both treated about the same? What's interesting to me on this slide is that only 1% of white officers surveyed said that whites are treated better than blacks, while 37% of them said that minorities are treated better. But then we contrast that with the black officer response, where 53% of black officers said that whites are treated better. This is further evidence of a cultural divide amongst law enforcement officers along racial lines. Next slide, please. All right, so where do we go from here? Next slide. All right, there's going to be some bullet points to pop up. But yeah, all right, so the evidence shows some stark contrast between white officers and black officers. In every major category, white and Hispanic officers stand in opposition to their black colleagues. Given that only 1% or 11% of police officers are black, it is likely that their opinions and their narrative are being drowned out by the dominant conservative narrative. Next slide, please. So what can we do? There's going to be three bullet points popping up. So we can start having some open, honest, and frank discussions between officers and also with community members. We begin to look at public safety with a holistic approach. Police are not the end-all, be-all of public safety. We are part of the larger picture. And we need to re-examine our recruiting models. Who are we looking for to be police officers in the 21st century? Law enforcement needs diversity, but not just of skin color, it needs diversity of opinion. Next slide. So this recruiting poster is harkening back to my dad and I's glory days in the Marine Corps. There's going to be 4 bullet points, if you could pull them up, please. So my challenge is, if you want policing to change, become a police officer. Legislation, policies, and training are good areas to focus on, but nothing will change until we change our culture. Policies can moderate behavior, but culture determines mindsets. Right, next slide. And I'll end my slideshow on another Martin Buber quote. He says, "As I actualize, I uncover." And I take this to mean that as we actualize a new version of law enforcement culture, we can uncover a better future for us all. And I believe that is my time. Next slide is my sources. If anyone wants to take a look at them, that's where I got all my stats and figures. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Dr. John, could you go back to his slide that talked about culture, that statement? Okay, no, it wasn't too far back. Well, that's okay. Mr. Turner, could you repeat the information that you stated on nothing will change? Please repeat that.
Right. It said legislation, policies, and training are good areas to focus on, but nothing will change until we change our culture. Policies can moderate behavior, but culture determines mindsets.
Very good. Okay, that is excellent. At this time, Dr. John, if you don't mind, we've had each of our presenters share their experiences and also share research and facts on what they were doing that have been excellent in trying to alleviate some of the systemic racist behavior in our country. And I would like to say now that I just applaud each of our presenters. I just wish we had more time, but we do not. And I tell you, we will definitely want to invite you again, because this is a discussion where we are just beginning. I would like to begin with, I do not see any questions in the chat room. I invite our audience to please put some questions in the chat room. We have a few minutes. I have 11:50, and but we do have a few minutes. We do have
a question, Dr. Bollinger.
You see one?
We do have a question from audience, from Arrow Giraffe.
I have a question, yes I do. And my question would be to Judge Teskey, Stephen. Here's my question. You know, as I listen to you talk and I listen to you share your background, your culture, you spoke about your father and what your father said to you. How can one's background and experiences, as well as culture in growing up, how can that be changed, especially if it is a racist type of culture? How can that be changed to bring about a more accepting culture? As Charles talked about, one of hope, one of lifting up people than tearing them down. Can you speak to that for us?
Certainly, Professor Bellinger. You know, it really, first of all, it's all about relationships, okay? I am confident, not only based upon research and studies, but anecdotally my experiences, is that to alter, modify behaviors, we must establish positive relationships with other people, including those that are not like us in terms of our thinking. You're not going to win everybody over. Notwithstanding the fact how much you create a positive relationship with somebody, there are just some folks that are going to be stuck. But I have experienced, okay, many people of my complexion, being white, okay, who have altered their thinking on this. Now it's taken some time, but you know, the people like myself who are working to modify, to change systems, okay, it's important that we maintain credibility. And you can't maintain credibility if you don't speak positively with other people and you're not open-minded, okay? Now, I will share this with you, and I'll leave, you know, one of my fellow judges many years ago, she just could, she was one of those who said, I'm colorblind. I have no racial bias whatsoever. Okay, she really believed that. Okay, but keep in mind that she's white, and like myself, we haven't experienced the things that AJ has experienced because we're not a person of color. All right. Look, Black Lives Matter has never disputed that all lives matter. That's not the point. But how can you maintain that all lives matter when a segment of our lives are being discriminated against and are going through pain and suffering? But with this white judge, when I brought in detention reform, she fought me tooth and nail, okay? And, you know, the major point in bringing in detention reform was to reduce racial disparities, okay? And so, you know, every time, what I was doing, she was trying to undo. Well, in her fight to sabotage what I was doing, she thought that she could go to IT and get data and show that in her court, her recidivist rates were lower than mine because I was releasing all these kids. Like Charles was saying, okay, you know, and, you know, about what's happening in Harris County. Look how many kids are not being detained and are not reoffending, okay? It's reframing the whole concept of juvenile justice. Well, I got that way back when, okay? All right? Now, having said that, she goes IT and she gets the data. I would later find out the chief judge at the time, okay, he told me that she came into her office, shut the door, and started crying. And she said, I've been wrong. Teskey's right. I've been hurting kids, especially kids of color. And I need your help to repair our relationship. Now, I don't think that ever would have happened, though, if I, in the first place, had never, if I had acted maliciously or had grudgingly, you know, all the stuff she did, but I didn't respond. I was always polite. I was always considerate. And I think that's what hurt her the most, too. Was not only was she wrong and she was hurting kids, okay, but I'm just a nice guy. We can't forget that, okay? Well, guess what? She became one of the best advocates. You know why? Because she was like the Saul of Tarsus, Paul, okay, who was on his way on the road to Damascus with warrants to arrest and execute Christians and had that revelation, okay, and then turn out to be one of the greatest advocates for Christianity. She was my Saul of Tarsus. So that's my anecdotal story.
And that's great. We need more of our Sauls of Tarsus. AJ, let me say this and then we will have to stop. AJ, wow, the vignettes that you described, and then you make the personal, how they impacted you, and then your experiences with police. Those experiences mirror the experiences that my son, Chad, a young Black man in Austin, Texas. We lived in Austin, and Chad would come home and say, Mom, I was stopped. My car searched. This is at 12 midnight. I said, you know what? You shouldn't be out that late. You need to get home. But here's what I want to ask you, AJ. What is it in your DNA that didn't make you hateful and angry? What did all of that negative experience, how did it make you the person you are today and not be, I guess I would say, and not have a sense of hatred for police officers?
Unfortunately, that's not an accurate statement. For considerable parts of my life, particularly prior to 30, for most of my adolescence and young adult life, I harbored nothing but hatred for police in particular, especially after the incident that happened in high school. But then for just the repeated inhumanity that I experienced at the hands of police officers over and over and over again. So it would be inaccurate to say that I did not harbor hatred. The shift, however, again, I'll kind of come back to a comment that the judge was making, is that, for me, a large part of the shift, emerged through relationships. As it turns out, one of the schools I went to in high school, my best friend was white. It was essentially an all-white school, not the one from the other story. I moved around a lot. And many of the students behaved in deeply racist manners, very anti-Black, and very open about it, not subtle or anything. That's just the part of the country it happened to be in. And he always stood up for me. He always was willing to stand against the other white students who mistreated me because I was Black. He grew up to become a police officer. Even to this day, when I talk with him, I can't get him to make the statement Black Lives Matter. He is diehard a believer of the statement that all lives matter. And I think inside of relationships like that, the complexity and the messiness of these issues is revealed. Like, he will never say Black Lives Matter, I suspect. And I will always be angry with him in a lot of ways for that. But I also know that if somebody came for me, he would be the first one to stand against them, whether they were a police officer or not. And so my life has just been filled of these contradictions of human nature. This is why I make the argument that people's intention, regardless of what they think it is, can't be how we evaluate people. We have to evaluate people on the impact they have. It's hard for me to understand his intentions, especially when I match them up with what he will and won't say in defense of me. But how he will behave when pushed has already been demonstrated. And so there's been a wellspring of hatred and anger in my heart for much of my life. And I'm old enough now that it's receding into the past. But I remember it. I can still feel it in my chest when I think about it. But it's the relationships that I've built that have given me a sense of what can we accomplish within the systems that we have. And it serves as a reminder. You can have a system full of people, none of whom personally identify as racist, or all of them could be Black, and that system could still perpetuate racist impacts. And so, judging individuals, but then also judging systems based on the impact that they create, and then being able to create partnerships with people from all walks of life to directly confront those impacts, has helped to calm a lot of that hatred and anger that I felt. You're muted.
Yeah,
Thank
what
you,
time
AJ.
do we have? What time do we have?
It's 12:03 right now. The talk AJ provided is really compelling. And that actually reminds me of Joe talk about, we need to have these open, honest, frank discussions between, white police and Black people, and how we can work together to make some changes. Right now, this is what we can do, Dr. Ballinger.
Yes.
You are supposed to be the authoritative host that should keep the room rolling. So if you want to continue the conversation for a little bit or for any questions, I'll leave it as it is. And I'm going to exit out, but this is our first time to do this. So I'm afraid after I leave as the host and the room will be, closed out suddenly. So pardon me if that happens.
Just what I would
host. Let me. Oh, I can make you a host. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Well, while she's doing that, we do need to go back to the noon breakout.
The main station.
Session.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do they get there? What do we do to get to the noon session?
I sent the panelists a link. Did you receive the link in your chat box?
Yeah.
And over there on that website, you should able to see a link to the, let me see, what's the closing session. So you click that one to go to event. On top of the page,
okay. So
there's a closing section, yes.
Okay.
So you need that link, Julia? You need that link?
No, I did not get a link.
Okay.
So if you'll send me one, but I do see one other question, and may I please ask?
We had a bunch of questions pouring in while our panelists were talking, and
okay.
I'm sure they enjoy your talk very much. Let me just pull out the question quickly. You may not have time to answer all the questions, and we have a question from Sergeant Ray Dietrich, and it's for Judge Kathy. That SROs are used
We can't hear you.
to handle these.
We can't hear you. Dr. John, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So here is a question. I just picked this, just pick one because we have so many questions from our audience. So apologize if I can't mention your question. And this is from Sergeant Ray Dietrich, and it's for Judge Teskey. Do you feel that the SROs were used in the beginning to handle discipline issues that should have been handled by school administrators?
That's an excellent question, Sergeant, and that is correct. The problem was not the SROs. Let me frame it this way. The problem was that systemically, we failed to think about this in advance by taking police officers that were on patrol, on the streets, and introducing them to the hallways of school campuses. All the SROs did exactly what they were trained to do. And that is, if they saw, or investigated an alleged offense and they had probable cause, they made an arrest like they would have out in the streets. It was our fault. It was the leadership of the school system, okay, all right, who's supposed to know adolescent behavior and adolescent brain development, that didn't, when they contracted with the Clayton County Police to bring police in, we should have retrained them at that point and retooled them at that point. So what happened, the dynamics is once we put them in there, and the police did exactly what they were trained to do. So it wasn't their fault. We need to keep that in mind, okay, at the point of entry. Then the educators, all right, they saw an opportunity, okay, to use police as another tool in their bag, you know, for discipline, not realizing that it just created another exclusionary disciplinary tool that pushed kids out of school. Gary Sweden, I'll end with this, a research professor at Arizona State University in 2006, did this gigantic study of high school students and dropout rates. And what he did is that he found that a student who's arrested on campus is twice as likely to drop out of school. A kid who appears in court is 4 times more likely to drop out of school, all right? Now here's the thing, okay? The reason why it's twice as likely is because the vast majority of kids who do get arrested are not on felony offenses. They're on misdemeanor offenses. And we know from the research, okay, that if you take low-risk kids committing misdemeanor offenses and treat them harshly, you are increasing the risk that they will become delinquent kids to commit felonies. The key to reducing juvenile crime is what Charles said. Stop introducing kids to the juvenile justice system. Stop having these misdemeanors go into court. Divert them. If you can divert them on the streets, great. Divert them at intake, great. Okay? As my 3-year recidivist study shows. Great question, Sergeant. Thank you for asking that.
And an outstanding response. Thank you for that. Thank you, AJ, for giving your email. And I think what we need to do, and I just hate to stop, but we must stop. It is time now to go to the noon session. I want to thank the panelists for your outstanding comments. And I'd like to thank the attendees for being here. We had 48, and that's good, very good. Okay, I'm going to say bye-bye, and you guys can click the link to the platform. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.